Since the mid-1990s, Formula 1 has taken safety incredibly seriously. Sometimes too seriously in the eyes of some, because whenever it starts raining, you get legions of people commenting on social media, "Let them race." But that's assuming a lot, because the problem isn't so much the actual wetness of the track, but the spray. It doesn't look so bad to us on the trackside cameras, but when drivers are getting on the radio and saying, "I can't see the safety car and I'm in first place," then you've got a bit of a problem. And I guarantee that if the cars went blind into turn 1 and 12 of them got wiped out, people would complain that the race was boring because there were only 8 cars left. And if somebody was to be seriously injured because a car was unsighted, then there would be an outpouring of, "How was this allowed to happen?" But anyway, the FIA does have a very safety-first approach, although there has been times when things haven't gone quite the way they should. The Bianchi accident, for instance, or even a couple of years ago, also at Suzuka, where there was a recovery vehicle on the track when it shouldn't have been there, as race control had allowed that vehicle to get onto the track while Pierre Gasly was still going round to the pits when the red flag was called. The FIA then summoned Gasly for driving too fast, which led to an outpouring of criticism from the media, team principals, fans and drivers alike. But the turning point for all of this was 1994, where 2 drivers were killed in as many days, although the tally could have been even higher still before that race even happened. The 1994 season has made up the bulk of the Storytime videos over the years, and usually they end up being the most popular. It's the season where if you were to write it as a film and say this was all based on true events, people who had never watched the sport before would be telling you that it never happened and it was all made up, and those true story claims were false and a total fabrication. But that's the thing. Everything that you read about the 1994 Formula 1 World Championship happened. The details contained within have been disputed, but Option 13, Imola, Hockenheim, Brazil, Silverstone, Adelaide, all happened. But 1994 wasn't a new thing with regards to safety. As mentioned in several videos, mostly within 1994 videos come to think of it, Jackie Stewart and the GPDA during the 1960s started a big push for driver safety, and it got them into a lot of hot water with the circuit owners. The old story of the drivers saying that the tracks had to evolve to accommodate the cars as they got more advanced, and then the tracks saying, "Go and play golf if you don't like it. Motor racing is dangerous. Cope harder." And one of my favourites, if you want to call it that, the sort of sub-stories within the larger story, is Jackie Stewart asking for the trees at Copse Corner, and that's why Copse Corner is called Copse Corner, because there were trees behind the barriers. He was asking for those to be cut down. And when the clerk of the course was told about this request, he said, if Jackie Stewart wants these trees cutting down, he knows where the saws are. And for some of you watching this right now, you might be thinking that. If it was so bad, why didn't Stewart, Hill, Clark, Brabham, Rindt, Hulme and the others just walk away? It seems to be the logical thing to do, right? But what the GPDA was trying to reduce was unnecessary death. They knew that there was always going to be a risk by going motor racing, but they wanted to reduce the chances of injury or death down from imminent to, "You're likely to make it home for tea, don't worry too much." If there was no barrier between the track and the trees, like at Hockenheim for instance, they put a barrier in. That way the car is more likely to bounce off the barrier than go into the trees, which is what killed Jim Clark, come to think of it. Then it was, okay, cars have sped up, let's put a catch fence there, let's strip a row of trees away, let's make the runoff bigger, expand this, extend that, do this and this and this. The list continues. If there was a chance that somebody could be killed because of something they could have done, they would do it. But while these changes tend to happen in between seasons because of the work that's required and the fact that everybody needs to get everything ready for the next season, if you decide that you're going to change something in one season and then bring it in for the next one for instance, sometimes massive regulation changes can happen mid-season, and this is exactly what happened in 1994. On the 1st of May 1994, the F1 drivers lined up on the grid for the San Marino Grand Prix. The mood in the air was already pretty glum, because around 24 hours prior the grid had learned of the death of Roland Ratzenberger. He'd crashed his Simtek at the Villeneuve kink and had been killed. 48 hours prior, Rubens Barrichello had crashed his Jordan at the Variante Bassa, hitting the exit curb, grabbing air and landing on top of the tyre wall, resulting in a sudden stop that required the immediate intervention of Professor Sid Watkins. Rubens was lucky. Roland, on the other hand, was not. Now, I'm no doctor or neurosurgeon, but there's the possibility that Roland was dead before that Simtek came to a stop. It was absolutely horrendous shunt. There's also the story that the 2 Pacific cars were offered the remaining 2 grid slots because Roland and Rubens weren't going to be able to take the grid for the Grand Prix, and they politely declined, which is one of the biggest sort of respect moments I've ever seen in motorsport. But then, somehow, the weekend got worse, if it was at all possible. After a safety car period following a start line pile-up that involved JJ Lehto, Pedro Lamy and others, as well as injuring several people in the crowd, including a policeman, Ayrton Senna left the road at Tamburello and crashed heavily into the concrete wall. And there was hope that Senna was going to be okay, given that we see Senna's head moving after the impact, but the injuries sustained were too much for the three-time champion to survive. In the modern era, it would have been a slam-dunk red flag after that start-line crash, especially as people in the crowd had been injured, but it really was a different time back then. In fact, it had only been the third time in F1 history that a safety car had been deployed. But that was the story of 1994, because it wasn't just the events at Imola that led to radical change. I know I've mentioned these accidents 100 times before and actually done a video on these accidents, but you do have to factor in Lehto and Alesi suffering neck and back injuries in testing. And then there was the near miss at Interlagos, where Eddie Irvine was determined to be the cause of an accident that involved him, Eric Bernard, Jos Verstappen and Martin Brundle, where Verstappen's Benetton lifts up onto Brundle's McLaren and then the left rear tyre of the Benetton strikes Kings Lynn's finest in the head. I am really not exaggerating when I say that Formula 1 could have had 3 deaths prior to Senna's at Imola, but the FIA could now see that things were getting way out of control. So instead of waiting until 1995 to hit the reset button, they decided to bring in changes within the next 2 or 3 Grand Prix. They were going to have to make some sweeping changes and try and get things slowed down to reduce the risk of injury prior to 1995, when the big reset button would be hit. Now, I have mentioned these changes quite a few times before, but I've never been into any detail as to what the changes were designed to achieve. So I'll break this down into cars and circuits, 2 distinct sections, so that you get everything explained, because usually I just put up a list and then move on to the main point. And the changes that had been made for the start of the 1994 season had been politically motivated, to say the least. The driver aid bans for 1994 had partially been the cause of some of the crashes, but there was also the return of refuelling that, at the time, only had the support of 2 people, Ferrari and Bernie. Now, more changes were being made, which might have given scope for a reset button for a few teams, most notably Williams, who was suffering from a very nervous car, a car that was not unlike the Red Bull is today. But the politics continued. When the Spanish Grand Prix arrived, which was the point where some items on Mosely's list were made mandatory, Flavio Briatore was against these changes, much like he was against refuelling when that was brought in. His argument was that the changes were being made too soon and it would make his cars unsafe, and he was promptly kicked out of the team principals meeting, leaving the remaining team bosses to fight things out. But Flavio did have a point, because at Silverstone in the lead up to that race, Pedro Lamy crashed heavily at Abbey and was lucky to survive. Such was the battle behind the scenes, only 9 cars took to the track for Friday morning practice. So what did the FIA do to the cars then? Well, I'm going to try and explain it all for you now because, well, I'm not an engineer. The first lot of changes came at Barcelona, but some came a little bit later. For the Spanish Grand Prix, the cars had several bodywork changes made to them to reduce downforce and therefore slow them down in the corners. Several refinements of these changes would happen over the next few years, but this was the starting point, really. Starting with the front wing was reduced in size, so less area to produce downforce. That's essentially it. But the issue is, I can't find how much they changed the sizes by. That's been the hardest part of this video. It could have been 10mm, it could have been 15mm, it could have been 2mm. I've googled and googled and googled and found nothing. Brilliant. The front wing was also raised up slightly, something that the FIA imposed again in time for the 2005 season to do exactly the same thing. A higher front wing produces less downforce because, well, physics. And that's not me understanding why, it's actually true. But all in, the downforce was reduced by around 15%, with the front wing being lifted up by 15mm. And sticking with the front wing, there was also a ban on any trailing bodywork that extended behind the front wheels. In the early 90s, it was not uncommon to see some cars fit front wings that had these extra pieces of bodywork. I think Minardi did it a couple of times in the early 90s, and Benetton had this setup in 1994, unless I'm misremembering things. But the overall design of the front wing was now just a front wing, not much else besides. From the Canadian Grand Prix onwards, the airboxes were modified in size to help reduce the power. Holes were cut into the engine covers to allow air to escape, which in turn meant less air available to do the sucking, squeezing, banging and blowing, and therefore slow the cars down through reducing power. At least, that's how I understand it. How much it reduced the power by, I'm not sure because the figures aren't to hand. But this was a stopgap before the FIA mandated the engines to be 3 litres, down from 3.5 litres from 1995 onwards. Teams had different approaches to how they tackled this. Williams cut holes in the spine of the engine cover, for want of a better term, while Tyrrell cut the top off entirely to have the roll hoop there as a formality. Ferrari cut their holes in the actual bodywork of the engine cover, while Benetton went for a similar solution as Williams, taking out the bare minimum. It was one of those rules that was open to interpretation, because it wasn't actually defined where you had to put these holes, so long as you had them. And then finally, at the rear wing had an exclusion zone written into the rulebook, which made it illegal for the teams to have rear wing bodywork within 150mm of the rear axle line. This change was met with some criticism because the new rear wings had to be rushed through, and this might have been the cause of Lamy's accident at Silverstone just before the Spanish Grand Prix weekend. The diffusers at the rear were also made smaller, and then the plank was added for the German Grand Prix, but I've done that video already. There were also changes to some of the circuits. Some of them were a more temporary solution just for the 1994 season, but others became much more permanent. At Spain, the FIA imposed a tyre wall chicane at what was known as Nissan Corner. The circuit was slightly different in those days. Turn 8 went slightly further out and then came back in, and as it rejoined the current track, it was a right-left flick that was almost taken flat out. The chicane slowed the cars down considerably before they got to that right-left flick, and while a low-tech solution, it did the job. But when I say it was the FIA that imposed it, it was the newly reformed GPDA led by Schumacher, Hill and others who pushed for it, and then the FIA said, okay, we'll put it in. Meanwhile, at the Canadian Grand Prix, a less rubbery, let's say, chicane was added on the back straight between the hairpin and the final chicane. And this wasn't a one-off either, because it was used again in 1995. On top of these new engine cover rules to reduce the ram air effect, the teams were now using pump fuel that your dad would have put in his car at the time to further reduce engine power. But it would be at Spa for the Belgian Grand Prix that the most drastic change was made, because the solution to slowing drivers down there was to make ROUGE and Radeon a lot like it was back in the 1960s, a section where you had to brake. Instead of it being this borderline flat-out adrenaline-fueled thrill ride that we know it as now, the FIA decided that they just weren't going to risk it with everything that had been going on that season. So the ROUGE complex was, for one race only, made slower. Temporary curbing was installed to show the drivers where to go, and it was narrowed at the same time, so that the drivers didn't try to go 3-4 wide through it. Painted on the track in the escape road, for want of a better phrase, were messages left in tribute to Ayrton Senna. Even though these modifications weren't in the Jeff Crammond Grand Prix 2 game, which mirrors the 1994 season, even if it was released in 1996, Trevor Sports has been doing this what if Senna lived type of thing, where the chicanes are still in at the Spanish and Canadian Grand Prix. I'll leave a link to his videos in the description if I remember. If I don't, then you actually can tell me that I forgot something. Meanwhile, at Silverstone, permanent changes were already being put in place in time for the British Grand Prix in reaction to the Imola crashes. Copse and Stowe corners were already in the process of being tightened, as well as the entry into club. But in the wake of Lamy's frightening shunt just prior to the Spanish Grand Prix, the BRDC installed a chicane at Abbey to reduce speeds going into bridge that kind of took the pizzazz away from that particular section. As mentioned in the Pedro Lamy testing accident video, the thinking was, well, if this has happened, then what happens if a slow-moving car is smashed into at speed? They're going to end up hitting the bridge that gives the corner its name. And they didn't know it at the time, but Mark Webber's accident at Valencia would later happen. So imagine if he'd clattered the bridge at Bridge Corner and not an advertising board. In total, 27 corners were considered problem spots by the FIA for danger, lack of runoff, or whatever it might be. So the FIA told the circuit owners to start doing things to try and slow the cars down, or at least reduce the risk if something bad was to happen at those specific corners. Now, thankfully, most of those corners like Copse, Stowe, Club, and so on were just simply reprofiled, but some of the corners were changed forever. The most notable of these is Tamburello. For the 1995 San Marino Grand Prix, the fast, flat-out left-hander was changed to a left-right-left chicane, with another left-right added up at the Villeneuve kink. The two spots where Senna and Ratzenberger were tragically killed. In more recent years, however, the track has returned to some form of its older high-speed self, as the run from the Rivazzas to Tamburello is now a flat-out blast like it was when the track first opened, as opposed to having the chicane just before the pits. At the same time, corners were modified to be safer and provide more runoff, which has become more common in recent years. While bigger gravel traps, bigger tyre walls, Tech Pro and other things have helped to reduce the injuries sustained in high-speed accidents, purists began to worry around the start of the 21st century that these bigger runoffs are less of a deterrent when it comes to staying on track, because drivers are no longer naturally penalised for running wide. As a result, the FIA has gone towards painting blue lines on curbs so they can manually check in slow motion if drivers have pushed track limits a bit too far. Although at some tracks the FIA has now had the circuit owners put these strips of gravel in so that if the driver runs wide they have to slow down, otherwise they might, wreck the floor, they might damage the skid block, and obviously you're going to get dust on the tyres as well. And kicking up dust as well is going to be a telltale sign to the FIA that a driver has pushed the track limits a tad too far. But the changes, although rash and quickly implemented, somewhat worked, because just over 12 months later, Mika Häkkinen had his monster shunt at Adelaide and was saved by 2 doctors who were in the crowd. I mean, it also helped that the hospital was on the same block, but, they were there to help him, and it was partly due to the changes in the cockpit designs that were made between Imola and Barcelona. In 1996, when high cockpit sides were made mandatory, Martin Brundle managed to crawl out of his battered Jordan when he was flipped over the top of Johnny Herbert at Melbourne. And since then, with the changes that have been made to various corners, the cars, the safety cells and everything else, drivers have been walking away from crashes that would have severely injured them, if not worse, if they'd happened in 1994. Häkkinen, as already mentioned, at Adelaide in 1995. Michael Schumacher at Silverstone in 1999 could have done more damage to himself if he'd been in a Brazil 94 spec Benetton. Luciano Berti at Spa, he would have most definitely have been killed, as would Robert Kubica at Canada in 2007. That list is by no means complete. Obviously, there are other ones that you can list. But it then leads into an interesting question. What if the FIA had never acted? What if they'd let the 1994 season play out without doing these changes, and not change things for 1995? What might have happened going forward? Would Formula 1 be as safe as it is now, or would it just be a case of it would have taken longer to get to this point? Would Brundle and Häkkinen have had worse things happen to them in their respective crashes? And is what the FIA has done to circuits across the world been at the expense of what made those tracks special? Or is it a case of, well, you can't have both? And it is sad at the same time that terrible things have to happen in order for things to change. It's why this stuff has the very morbid name of tombstone technology. But I don't know. I actually don't have an answer to any of this. Maybe you do. I would say answers on a postcard at this point, but I think you might need to send a fax. So then, a look at the rash changes that Formula 1 made following the events of Imola 1994, but in a bit more detail than what I usually do as a fact dump in 1994 related videos. If this has been an interesting video for you, then please, by all means, like the video so I know I did a good job, and for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank and other bits and pieces, there will be a link to Patreon down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and any other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks for the one and done donations, and memberships if you want to do Patreon style support but don't want to go through Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.